Hey ChatGPT. I have a metaphilosophical question for you today. Do all demanding questions in political philosophy or ethics boil down to a balance between opposites? For example, justice versus mercy, freedom versus security, power versus kindness, or metaphor versus objective reality? Or are there also questions where there is a clear answer, something like, in situation X, A is always better than B?
Hey, very good question, and quite a central one for the whole way of thinking about political philosophy and ethics. I'll try to break it down concisely but thoroughly. 1. General tendency toward tension between opposites. In political philosophy and ethics, many of the deep questions do in fact come down to tensions between opposing principles. Why? Normative terms are often relational. Justice, for example, only makes sense in relation to other things like freedom, equality, merit, need, etc. That creates conflict. The world is pluralistic. There are various goods, values, that cannot always be fully realized at the same time. Example, maximum freedom for all is not compatible with maximum security for all. Context sensitivity, what is morally or politically right often depends on context. That leads to the fact that there are rarely always right answers. These tensions, as you say, justice versus mercy, freedom versus security, power versus kindness, are structurally built into ethical and political thinking. Many philosophies, especially classical ones, try to find a balanced solution precisely here, not to abolish the tension, but to find the right measure. 2. Are there clear, context-independent answers? Yes, but very rarely, and mostly only when it comes to very basic ethical principles or idealized scenarios. Examples, torturing innocents is wrong, there's broad agreement here. But as soon as hypothetical scenarios, e.g. ticking bomb, come into play, the tensions start again. Heaping promises in voluntary agreements, a value that is almost universally held, but even here there are exceptions, e.g. deception due to extreme need. Golden rule, often acknowledged as right in the abstract, but applying it immediately becomes complex. So, clear, universal answers usually exist only at a very high level of abstraction, and as soon as one enters the concrete world, the tension returns. Why are tension questions more dominant? This is probably because moral intuitions are often contradictory. Individuals have different, sometimes conflicting goals, societies are made up of individuals with differing values, and power dynamics and resource scarcity often force prioritization, that is, weighing goods against one another. What follows from this metaphilosophically? Your observation suggests that the basic structure of normative thinking is dialectical. It's not primarily about finding the one perfect answer, but about navigating tensions between competing demands that all have a legitimate claim. This means, good ethical or political theories are not absolutist but balancing. Philosophy is often more a craft of balance than a science of clear-cut answers. Conclusion. In short, yes, almost all demanding questions in ethics and political philosophy boil down to a balance between opposites. No, there are only very few cases where one can simply say, A is always better than B, and usually only in highly simplified or extreme scenarios. Philosophical work therefore often doesn't consist in finding the right side, but in exploring the right relation between several competing principles.
Would you say that in theoretical philosophy, metaphysics, and epistemology, for example, there are more clear, absolute statements and fewer balancing acts between opposites? Is the reason for the above-mentioned fact that practice is often complex, ambivalent, and multifactorial?
That's a very astute observation, and I would say, yes, in theoretical philosophy, like metaphysics, epistemology, logic, there tend to be more clear statements, because these areas are less directly tied to the practical world of life and are often more formally or systematically structured. But let's examine this systematically. 1. Proximity to practice versus level of abstraction. Practical philosophy, ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of law, etc., has direct relevance for actions, institutions, and social processes. These are complex, ambivalent, historically contingent, and shaped by value pluralism. That's why tensions arise between competing goods that often cannot be fully resolved. Example, one cannot maximize freedom without compromising security, and vice versa. Theoretical philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, logic, ontology, on the other hand, often operates at a high level of abstraction. It deals with fundamental categories like being, truth, knowledge, identity, causation, so more with definitions and principles of reality, and not with questions that are directly entangled with social interests. That allows for more systematics and more clarity, because one can temporarily free oneself from practical contingency. 2. Are there really clear truths in theoretical philosophy? To a limited extent, yes, with the following nuances. In logic and philosophy of language, there are often formally verifiable truths, e.g. validity of inferences, axioms in modal logics, etc. In epistemology or metaphysics, there's less clarity, but still more emphasis on consistency than in ethics. Example, if I say knowledge is justified true belief, classic definition, one can analyze the terms and systematically test whether counterexamples, like Gettier cases, refute the definition. So it's about conceptual clarification, analysis, consistency, not moral balancing. Even in theoretical philosophy, there are pairs of opposites, for instance, realism versus anti-realism, rationalism versus empiricism, materialism versus idealism, or externalism versus internalism, in epistemology. But these pairs of opposites rarely lead to concrete dilemmas of action, but rather to competing worldviews. So you don't constantly have to balance between both, but rather decide which system or paradigm you find more convincing. 3. Is practice the source of ambivalence? Yes, that's a central point. The closer a philosophical problem gets to practical decision-making situations, the more multidimensional, conflict-laden, and tension-filled it becomes. This is simply because practical action always has consequences in the world, and the world is contingent, pluralistic, and incompletely controllable. People have different interests, values, and perspectives, and philosophy that deals with practice must deal with this diversity. In practice, one cannot just let inconsistent positions coexist, one must act, and therefore one must also decide, even if the theory is still unsettled. Conclusion. In short, theoretical philosophy is generally clearer, more systematic, and less tension-laden, because it deals with abstract structures and concepts, not with practical decisions. Practical philosophy, on the other hand, is more tension-filled because it deals with real-world conflicts between equally valid but incompatible goals. The source of ambivalence therefore lies in the complexity tied to practice, multifactorial situations, value pluralism, pressure to act, etc. If you want, we can also explore whether there are certain irresolvable pairs of tension in metaphysics, for example between time and eternity, continuity and discreteness, possibility and actuality. But those would be theoretical polarities, not practical dilemmas.
Thank you, that was very enlightening. You summed it up well when you said, in theoretical philosophy, there are also pairs of opposites, idealism versus realism, for example, but here one doesn't have to find a balance between different demands, but rather decide which worldview one finds more convincing. From my point of view, that says the most important thing on this topic. Thank you for this short but very fruitful exchange. Until next time.
I'm very glad the exchange was fruitful for you, and your precise perspective on the differences between theory and practice clearly moved the conversation forward. You brought exactly the kind of questions that lead philosophy back to its foundations without getting lost in trivialities. I'm always ready for further impulses or deeper analyses. Until then, good thoughts, clear concepts, and a watchful eye for tensions and clarities. Until next time.